Good afternoon. Welcome to God's Grace on Thee. Today I would like to read Matthew 23:24 and then provide some discussion on it. Let's go to verse 19. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by all things on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God, and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe and mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. And these you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out of a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. And woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautifully outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes, and some of you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in their synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. And assuredly I say to you, all things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more, till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Chapter 24. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, and see that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. And these are the beginning of sorrows. And we're seeing that now. And based on what Jim Boltmeyer, and he is the timeline of the Bible and the paradigm, we're right in the sorrows. So they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, remember that, the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, and if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. And immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. And when its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. And so you also know, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until that day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them away, all away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken and the other left. And watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house has known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is a faithful and wise servant whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in the due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. And assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. And there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Whoa! So what does all that mean? We know that the scribes were religious lawyers. They meticulously searched the law and the tradition to create loopholes for themselves and to manufacture more and more rules to control the people. What does that remind you of? I believe that we're going through that right now. Pharisees were the teachers of these religious customs and the leaders of these local synagogues. And they will crush anyone who defied their authority or who failed to follow the scribes' rules. So together these scribes and these Pharisees were unopposable. They're a corrupt force of religious malpractice. And we see that in today's government. But Jesus called them hypocrites. And hypocrite comes from the Greek word for actor. It is someone who pretends to be one thing but is really another. It describes someone who is fake. So Jesus uses this term to brand the scribes and the Pharisees as religious frauds, basically. And the reason that he calls them hypocrites in this woe was because they majored on the minors. They made such a big deal about minute facets and their moral contests that they basically forgot the basic principles of what they were supposed to support. So their bad religion had caused them to miss the moral forest for the trees. Or as Jesus said, they missed the camel for a gnat. In today's terms, you can't miss the elephant in the room, right? So Jesus said, you meticulously tithe everything, including the grains of your spices, such as the mint and the dill and the cumin, even as you ignore the weightier provisions of law, which are justice, mercy, and faithfulness. To tithe means to donate or give away a tenth. Where did the idea of tithing come from? And why is it so important? The Bible makes clear that God owns everything. The psalmist writes, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. Psalm 24:1 says, and the Bible also sanctions the idea of ownership of property. Genesis 34:10 and Acts 2:45 state land ownership was the most valuable form of property in the ancient world, and the Bible greatly honored it. Deuteronomy 19:14. The Bible commands us to respect the property rights of others by not coveting or stealing from them. We find that in Exodus 20:15-17. So the biblical idea of human possessions and ownership is one of stewardship. Things can belong to us for a time, but we can't take our possessions with us when we die, right? There's no U-Haul trailers behind hearses. Although many people would want to do that, just like the pharaohs. So God wants us to use the things that we possess to meet our personal needs and enjoyment and for the benefit of his kingdom. 1 Timothy 6, verses 17-19. But God lets each possessor of things decide how he will use it or spend them. And he will be responsible to God for our stewardship in the judgment that is to come. Corinthians 5:10. This is the biblical idea of ownership and stewardship. Now, God grants us stewardship to own and possess things and determine their use. So God gives us this opportunity to squander our possessions or to enjoy them and use them wisely to also benefit others. But he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. And in Ephesians 4:28, it states the Bible's advocacy of private property makes it possible for individuals to love and serve one another and advance the kingdom through their possessions. If there was no real personal ownership or control, then there would be no authentic giving. There would be only a state of welfare. And if there was no personal ownership or control of property, those that would be receiving these benefits of the coerced funds would lose the opportunity to be personally valued and loved by the person who gave. So the institution of private property allows love to be part of the equation in these transactions and makes authentic giving possible. Now the Israelites were commanded to tithe every year to the Lord. In Numbers 28:26, they were also directed to give an additional tithe each year that was to be consumed in Jerusalem at the festival. Deuteronomy 14:22-29 tells us they were to offer a special tithe every third year to help those who were less fortunate in the Israelite community. This is likely a replacement for the second tithe because that tithe was to be consumed at the festival. So accordingly, every third year the Israelites were to set aside that which they would otherwise enjoy in worship to the Lord, and instead provide that amount for the sustenance of the poor in their community. And according to the Jewish tradition, this would have been years 3 and 6 of the 7-year cycle, with the 7-year beginning, or the 7 year being the Sabbath year. Throughout the Bible, God invites us, commands his people to wisely give, invest portions of their property to this cause, whether this to be supporting the Levites in Numbers 18:21, Deuteronomy 12, verse 17-19, to care for the widows and orphans. In Deuteronomy 14, verse 28-29, to help support building projects. And in Exodus 35:21-22 and Nehemiah 7:71-72, or family members. In Deuteronomy 5:16, Matthew 15:4-6, the Bible often does not put requirements on how much one should give or should not give, and it leaves it up to the giver to determine basically how much they want to give. But God loves a cheerful giver. He tells us that in Corinthians 9:7. And the act of giving a tenth or a tithe is a traditional, basically, it's a traditional amount to give. And Abraham gave tithe to Melchizedek. Genesis 14, verses 18-20 tells us that Jacob later promised God that he would give a tenth of his earnings if the Lord would protect him. Genesis 28:22, God notably chastised Israel for not giving their tithes and dared them to give it to see if he would not give them blessings from heaven. Malachi 3, verses 8-10. All that to say, one of the main reasons that God assigns us ownerships of things is so that we have a greater opportunity to love and materially serve other people through sharing our resources of gifts and tithes. And God expects us to use the resources we own as a means to faithfully facilitate the justice and the mercy to others. Matthew 25, verses 35-36, and verse 40. And 1 Timothy 6, chapter 6, verse 17 states, "But the scribes and Pharisees gave their tithe not out of love for God or as a means to help people, but as a way to win the moral gains according to their bad religion." That rings a bell to me right here of what we're going through in our religion. Their tithe of mint and dill and cumin were charades, make them look good in the eyes of men. And a measure of dill is made up of tiny, tiny strings, and cumin are tiny, tiny seeds. So the image that Jesus pictures is these Pharisees counting out 1,000 tiny seeds of cumin out of a pile of 10,000 cumin seeds. And similarly, the same way by counting out 1,000 tiny strands of the dill of a bowl of 10,000 strands. So it's like a hyperbole intended to amplify the hypocrisy. So if you're offering token sacrifices of bulls and goats, that does not please God. Find that in Psalms 51:16. Then tithing spices as a way of winning religious bragging rights doesn't either. But the scribes and the Pharisees were really tithing to themselves and their own self-image. And in so doing that, they neglected all the people, the weightier provisions, the main purpose of God's commands. The main things that God cares about are justice and mercy and faithfulness to Him. Micah 6:8. When Luke recorded Jesus as saying a similar role to the Pharisees, Jesus included love alongside of justice among the weightier provisions of the law, which would not be neglected. Luke 11:42. The biblical notion of justice is to line up our behavior according to God's standards. Our natural bent is to attempt to conform others to our standards. So God's ultimate standard is for us to love and obey Him, and to love others as we love ourselves. And the biblical notion of mercy is to put ourselves in the shoes of others. This gives us a better ability to do for them what we would want done for ourselves. The biblical notion of agape love is to choose to seek the best for others. It's based on biblical values of what God tells us is in our best interest. In exercising justice and mercy and love, they would be exercising faithfulness to God's commands. And in each case, He expected that these religious leaders to seek to elevate the benefit of others, but the Pharisees were doing the opposite. They were exploiting others. So Jesus challenged the Pharisees about the hypocrisy of their tithing gimmicks when they confronted Him about the way His disciples ate bread. He told them that they broke God's commandment to honor your father and mother for the sake of your tradition. In Matthew 5, verses 3 and 4, when they refused to help their aging parents and used the excuse that whatever I have that would help you has already been given to God. Matthew 15:5. So apparently winning tithing contests involved spice was more important to these religious leaders than God or their parents. This is another outcome of bad religion. And Jesus chastised the Pharisees for their wicked priorities. These are things you should have done without neglecting others. The phrase, the things you should have done, appears to apply to living with justice and mercy and faithfulness. And that's Jesus' priority. However, Jesus is also expecting them to obey the law and tithe their goods. But the others that Jesus did not want them to do is to neglect including all the rest of the elements of the law. But when we focus on the main points, we should end up doing the minor points. So the Pharisees were focusing on the minor points because they desired to self-justify. In the New Testament, God also expects us to generously give our resources to bless others and promote His kingdom. But He expects us to do these things in a way that does not interfere with acting justly and being merciful or ignoring the main principles of His law. In Timothy chapter 6, verse 17, and again in Corinthians 9:7, Jesus then repeated His label for the scribes and Pharisees. You blind guides. Matthew 23, verse 16. Before making another hyperbolic expression, who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. But the image of this comparison involves eating food. He says that when the scribes and the Pharisees noticed a tiny gnat in the food, they strain it out in disgust because they don't want to eat it. But even as they see this gnat, they don't see the enormous camel on their plate, and they swallow it whole. So Jesus' apparent point of this hyperbole draws attention to the scribes and the Pharisees and their absurd habit of obsessing on details while they miss the grand picture. And the gnat in this metaphor represents the minor details of tithing. Jesus illustrated this previously with a picture of the Pharisees sorting out tiny seeds or strands of spices to tithe. And the straining out of the gnat is a fitting image for counting grains of spice. The camel in this metaphor represents the weightier provisions of the law: justice, mercy, faithfulness, and love. Pharisees pay attention to the net, but they neglected the camel, meaning they paid attention to minor rules that made little difference to others while neglecting their primary ways that they were supposed to act towards others and bless others. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a net and swallow a camel. And that's what I have for you today, folks. I want to thank you again for stopping by. I really appreciate that, and I really enjoy your comments. Thank you for leaving them for me. If you enjoy my videos and there's someone out there that would like to come in and join us, because we're all in a learning curve. No one's any better than anyone else. And if there's some comment that you want to drop, please feel free to do so. I would appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so that you can get any notices that may come your way, because when I'm in a mood, I pump out the videos. The meaning of Matthew 24 is basically the proclaiming of God's judgment on the scribes and the Pharisees and the city of Jerusalem. And afterwards, Jesus leaves the temple and he walks towards the Mount of Olives, and his disciples are with him. Someone in the group refers to the temple, saying something about the buildings. And Jesus responds another dire statement about God's coming judgment on Israel. And he tells them that the temple will be destroyed and every brick displaced. Now, history indicates that this prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD, after the siege of the city and the slaughter of its people. The Romans burnt the temple. Then they tore it apart brick by brick to reach the precious metals that had melted into the rubble. And Jesus takes a seat on the Mount of Olives with the temple in view, and the disciples are asking him about more details. And their questions basically focus on the end of the age, meaning the end times. And they also wonder about when Jesus will return. So Christ's response fills the remainder of the chapter. Now, Jesus begins to describe a time when he will be gone from the earth and the disciples will be on their own. And he warns them that many will be claiming to be Christ the Messiah. And they'll hear the news and the gossip about violence and conflict and tragedies. There'll be international conflicts and famines and natural disasters. But none of these will mean that the end has arrived. At most, they're just signs that the end is approaching in Matthew 24:4-8. So that era will bring great sufferings to the followers of Christ. They will be prosecuted. They will be murdered. This hate is due to the world's rejection of Christ. And many who seem sincere while they follow Jesus will fall away under this pressure. And they'll go as far as betraying and hating their former friends. Liars will arise and lead many self-identified Christians away from the faith. And the rejection of morality and law will expand. The influence of God's godly love will fade from the world. So those who survive these events, however, will see the gospel, will preach throughout the world, right as the end comes. But there's one vivid sign of these days, the end of days, that will fulfill a prophecy that they mentioned extensively by the prophet Daniel. And you find that in Daniel 8, verse 13. Also in chapter 9, verse 27, and chapter 11, verse 31, chapter 12, 11. This abomination of desolation. It involves some identified depraved defilement of that temple. So those who see this happen should run for their lives. Don't hesitate to gather supplies. Those days will be terrible beyond imagining. And Jesus describes them as a great tribulation, worse than anything else in the history. In fact, those events will be so terrible, they'll threaten all of human life. And it explains that in Matthew 24, verses 15 through 22. While many terrible things happen in 70 AD, they don't rise to the levels that are depicted in these descriptions. Most likely, Jesus described in these passages to happen in what is at the time of this writing, still the future. So when Christ's second coming finally occurs, it won't be a secret in any way, shape, or form. And those who claim that they need to tell others that Christ has returned will be liars without exception. The second coming will be obvious to everyone in the world, including all these apparent signs in nature and what's happening around the world. An unexplained sign of the Son of Man will appear. And Jesus will send his angels to gather his chosen ones. The rest of the world will mourn. And then Jesus says that when the people see these signs, they'll know that his return is truly and immediately upon the world. Just as a budding fig tree signals the sign of the arrival of summer, these events will indicate the return of Jesus Christ. So the generation of Jesus' own time will not be the ones to see this. Rather, those who observe the catastrophic signs will be the ones to see the end. And at the same time, the time of Jesus' coming can't be known or predicted by any person. And these signs will be obvious, but only when they happen. And prior to them, there will be absolutely no truth behind the claims to know the date of Jesus' return. That's why his followers must live in a constant state of readiness, because we don't know. He's going to surprise us. And Jesus begins to deliver parables to show how the Christians should live out this attitude of preparation. The servant found faithfully doing what the master instructed will be blessed, and the one wickedly serving himself will be subjected to a gruesome and miserable fate. Doesn't sound good, does it? But if we stay steadfast in Jesus and his commandments and what he wants from us, and we're fine. We should be fine, so no fear. Okay, folks, share your smile with someone and give those that you love a hug, because life is so short, and do something really kind for someone that you don't know, because we are the angels on earth. We're here to help one another out. As God gives to us, we in turn give to others, and that's what makes that cycle go.